Okay, so we're going to be talking this week about careers in international development and NGOs. I don't have a PowerPoint today. We're going to be, I've got a few notes that I'm going to be kind of reading through and talking to you about. So I think probably the best thing to start off with is what are NGOs and what is international development. I think the best definition is really that international development or global development is it's a sort of fairly wide concept which basically concerns the level of development on an international scale. And it's related to the concept of international aid, but I think it's quite important to draw a distinction between international development and, say, disaster relief or humanitarian aid. I mean, they're all kind of wrapped up together, but international aid, disaster relief and humanitarian aid is sort of the short-term response, I think, is the best way of thinking about it. So for some of the crises that we unfortunately see way too much of coming up on our television when there are charity pushes, and there's an immediate response to a crisis through war, through famine, through natural disasters, and there's an attempt to alleviate suffering in the immediacy. That is disaster relief. But what we're talking about today is international development, which is about really implementing longer term solutions. So it's helping developing countries to create a kind of necessary capacity needed to provide sustainable solutions to problems. I think that's effectively what we're talking about. So what is a sustainable project? A sustainable development project is one that will be able to carry on indefinitely, ultimately, without further international support. So the idea is to set up longer term projects that are going to help these developing countries to become self-sustainable. So this could encompass, and I think as you start to look into the field of international development, it's really big. So you're talking about foreign aid, right? Healthcare, education, addressing all sorts of issues around poverty, around gender equality, preparing for disasters, the rights of children, economics, human rights, infrastructure, environment. So it's a huge and broad area. And I guess the next thing that, that's the kind of definition. So the next thing that might be important to do is think about where the jobs are. And that's when we get into thinking about things like NGOs. Okay, so what is an NGO? Let me read you a definition that I think is pretty good. So the term non-governmental organisation, that's what an NGO is. It normally refers to organisations that are neither part of a government nor conventional for-profit businesses. They're normally set up by ordinary citizens. I mean, I could start an NGO, you could start an NGO. They are typically funded by governments through charity or through businesses. So the private sector also helps to fund NGOs. There are some NGOs that avoid funding altogether and are simply run by volunteers. Again, when you start looking into the sector, you'll find how incredibly varied and diverse it is, and also how many of these NGOs exist, these non-governmental organisations that have often been set up by individuals. So the numbers I've got registered in the UK, NGOs registered, that means there are others that aren't registered, but registered about 1,800 in the UK. In the States, the number of NGOs operating is about 1.5 million. I mean, there are a lot of these organisations around. However, although that's where people tend to think that the jobs are, it's also important to remember that's not the only place you can find jobs. So where else can you find jobs within this sector? Government departments, emergency relief organisations, consultancies. I mean, there are, I've come across a couple recently. There's one called Africa Practice. That is a strategic communications consultancies that works with governments and corporate clients in Africa. Think tanks. So just to put you in the picture if you're not sure what a think tank is, it's an organisation that performs research and advocacy concerning topics such as social policy, political strategy, economics, military technology and culture. So these guys do research and then they will advise governments and companies and other organisations on strategy. So, for instance, an example of a think tank, let me see if I've got an example here somewhere, I believe I do. An example of a think tank is, so the Overseas Development Institute is, quote unquote, the UK's leading independent think tank on international development and humanitarian issues. They do a lot of research and they will advocate on public affairs policy related to overseas and developing countries and advising on various topics to do with that. So that's another place that you might find jobs, think tanks, and then multilateral organisations. So this is the EU, the UN, and associated agencies. And also in the private sector as well. I think it's important to remember that there are many examples of people working in private sector organisations who are engaged with the developing world. So that could be in accountancy or construction, logistics, computing, security, these kind of areas. So you can work for the private sector and have an impact on developing countries if that's what you would like to do. How do you go about finding a job? Well, there is no single place to look for vacancies, especially for entry-level jobs. There are some well-known publications. I mean, you might want to start looking at publications like Third Sector, New Internationalist as well, which will have some vacancies. And the Guardian actually covers the sector very, very well and has a very lively vacancy section, and it's good to keep your eyes open for jobs there. And our website, which is graduatesintocareers.co.uk, graduatesintocareers.co.uk, also has entry-level jobs for the sector. There is an agency, there are a few recruitment agencies that specialise in this area. One to look at is DevEx, D-E-V-E-X. But the key thing, and I suppose what I'd really like to get onto, is getting into how do you break into this sector? And over again, what we find is that what they're going to look for is, guess what, relevant previous experience. So, how are you going to get relevant previous experience in international development while you're still a student? Good question. I think if you can sort of think about it from the perspective of the organisation that you might be getting into, if you're looking to work in international development, probably the number one thing they're going to look for, first of all, is an interest in international affairs, and that kind of probably means travelling. So if you are interested in a specific country, if it's India, and I know it's not always easy to do this sort of thing, but have you been to India? Have you got some experience of what life might be like for the people who live in that country? Voluntary work, absolutely critical. It demonstrates that you have. I suppose it demonstrates that you're serious about getting into a sector which is about helping other people in a practical way. It is never enough just to say, I'm interested, right, at an interview or on an application form. It's never enough to say, I want to help people. That's great, and I think for anybody who's going to work in this kind of sector, of course, starting from that place is really important, but then you've got to demonstrate that you've done something about it. So there are lots and lots of opportunities to volunteer within the UK. Look at idealist.org. There's another organisation called Do It. You can Google these. They will have lots of opportunities for getting involved in a voluntary capacity or through through Heythrop. So making the most of the time that you're a student to demonstrate for future employers that you're serious about getting involved and providing practical help and support to others. There are very few graduate schemes in the sector. I mean, a couple to mention: the UK government's Fast Stream programme, which places people in departments like the Foreign Office, the Department for International Development, DFID, has its own scheme, so that's also worth looking at too. But remember, to get on these kind of graduate schemes, you're going to have had the experience beforehand. So you're going to have demonstrated interest in the sector, a commitment to the sector, commitment to volunteering, that sort of thing. There are a few organisations that we've come across that will recruit people that don't have huge amounts of experience. So a couple to look at are GOAL, G-O-A-L, which is an international humanitarian agency dedicated to alleviating the suffering of the poorest of the poor. That's from their website. Another one is MEDAIR, M-E-D-A-I-R, which, from their website, helps people who are suffering in remote and devastated communities around the world survive crisis, recover with dignity, and develop skills to build a better future. Another thing to think about is, if you're able to take a longer term approach to this, what is required is skills, right? So what is required is skills and experience by developing countries and by organisations that go into developing countries. So is it possible to take a longer term view, to get some skills here, to get a basis in a profession, and then take some of those skills and move sectors? So I'm talking about things like, could you get training in IT or in accountancy or in teaching, something that's going to enable you to say to organisations in the future, I have a specific skill that I'd like to use. There are a couple of internship programs, again, that we've come across. SANA, S-A-A-N-A, SANA Consulting is one to look at, and also there's something called the IDL Group, which is a consulting firm that delivers tailored international development consultancy services based in the UK. Other tips: be flexible. Be prepared to start low, be prepared to start at the bottom, be prepared to start in an administration role. We sometimes get asked about whether or not a master's is important to enter into this sector. The research that we've conducted seems to demonstrate that it is increasingly important, but it's not critical at the moment. But it is an increasingly competitive field, which means that more and more people are trying to get into it, so more and more people are getting masters in order to get into it. It might be something that you are going to come up against. Finally, a little bit on applications. It's a competitive sector. You need to make the most of your experience and qualifications. You need to be specific. I think this is another thing that's worth thinking about. It's not enough to simply write an application that says you want to fight poverty, or you, as I said earlier, or you want to help people. I think it's really critical to think about who you want to help and where you want to help them and why that is. So are you a woman who's particularly interested in supporting women's rights? Do you have a cultural background that connects you specifically to one of the African countries? What is your specific area of interest, and why is that a specific area of interest, and what have you done to further that specific area of interest? So, for instance, if you're interested in women's groups, you should be looking to involve yourself here with groups that support, that advocate for women, support women's rights. So it's thinking, I think, specifically that's really important, because that will back up your application when it comes to applying for internships and jobs.